Good afternoon. I'm Todd, and the research paper I'm going to be covering is Exploring Educational Approaches to Addressing Misleading Visualizations by Ji-Yun Roh and Martina A. Rao from the University of Wisconsin. This is a secondary research-focused paper, not a primary research-focused one, so it's going to be a lot of examining other papers and combining the information that they've gathered. First thing we're going to check out, though, is this diagram. This is included in the paper and is a gold standard for misleading visualizations. Take a quick look at it. You see anything weird about it? 2005, Florida enacted its stand your ground law, and number of murders committed using firearms seems to go down, right? If you look at it a little closer, maybe here, those numbers aren't in the right spots. The chart's upside down. Again, this is a gold standard for misleading visualization. They inverted the axis. The 0 is at the top. The corrected version shows that number of murders committed using firearms actually increases. So we're going to define misleading elements. Anything wrong with the title, anything biased in the legend, any suspicious annotations, inverted or truncated axes, bad area encoding, all misleading. A lot of misleading charts are not done on purpose. It's just bad chart design, a failure to maintain graphical integrity. When we see a visualization, a chart, a graph, a plot, we make a knee-jerk judgment of it, whether it's complicated or simple. If it's simple, we just intuitively process it really quick and pick up a conceptual message from it. If we interpret it as complicated, then we start entering a cycle of top-down and bottom-up critical thinking examination of the visualization. A lot of maliciously misleading visualizations will try to skim under the complicated graph critical thinking process. So we'll see a lot more misleading elements in simpler charts than complicated ones. Research questions for this paper: which elements of misleading data visualizations make viewers susceptible to misinterpretation? So what parts of graphs being messed up lead people to misinterpret the message? And research question 2, how do existing educational interventions prompt viewers to accurately interpret misleading data visualizations? What evidence-driven practices are there for training viewers to combat misinformation or misleading visuals? So research question 1, when reviewing the papers, a lot of them only examine bar plots, line plots, pie charts, scatter plots. These are more common. There's less things you can mess up in them, and they're just easier to categorize, easier to process, easier to combat misleading elements in. These papers that they examined didn't really mess with more complicated or qualitative information: parallel coordinate plots, Sankey diagrams, chord diagrams, tree maps. These are a lot less common and typically more scientific in nature, or they can require a lot of additional background education for a viewer to even interpret in a non-misleading sense. Sources for the data: Google Scholar, IEE. One thing I wanted to put in here that I thought was really interesting is they used the snowball method, where they examine articles in the reference section and citation lists of relevant articles. I'm sure we've all done that on Wikipedia, right? And here's the breakdown of all the articles they examined. You know, I got to read all this. I put a big red rectangle around the main findings if you wanted to pause it and take some time to read, but I've got slides that condense all this stuff anyways, so don't worry about it too much. How many of these do they have? Wow, they had a lot. Manipulated scales were the most common visualization misinformation tactic or accidental thing that they found. I think the final count was like 30%. Truncated axes are fairly common. They significantly distort the perception of a viewer. Where you cut off an axis. I've got some examples later, I'll show you. They lead viewers to magnify differences between bars, and viewers with low education or low visual literacy, or just low literacy in general, are the most susceptible to this kind of manipulation. Inverted axes, they cause viewers to misinterpret trends, and us viewers of visualizations tend to rely on the small number being in the bottom left-hand corner, or if the camera's flipped, it's over here. And if the small number is in the top left or the top right corner, it can cause a complete inversion of our perception of value. Here we go. So row A is a truncated axis. You'll see on the left diagram, it goes from 0 to 100, the y-axis. And on the right diagram, it goes to 50 to 100. And if you just look at it real quick, the area perception of both of these graphs is completely skewed. Row B is a inverted y-axis, 0 to 100 on the left and 100 to 0 on the right. Row C is a 3D manipulation of a pie chart. I've got a little section on 3D coming up. It causes you to distort how much area we perceive as allocated to each individual value in a pie chart. Dual axes, these are a little less common. It's where you have two charts superimposed over each other with a different axis on the left and the right on the Y. They significantly reduce viewer accuracy, increase error rates, and read time, even if you are able to interpret all the information in it correctly. Logarithmics, they can misrepresent exponential values. They can be used, and you can mess with the logarithmic scales to compress and flatten out growth trends in a positive or just a more positive light. It isn't always malicious manipulation of the data. 3D encoding distorts perception. This is most applicable to pie charts, but if we also messed with area encoding, that could also 3D distorts the area encoding, which also has the least accuracy for interpreting quantitative values. I think bubble charts were specifically mentioned in this as having, because they aren't squares, we interpret the area in them differently than if it was like a tree map. Aspect ratio in other charts, like bar charts and pie charts, can cause distortion of value, even if it's not area encoded. If you start messing with the width and the height of bar charts, it can cause viewer misinterpretation. Now, misleading context is one of the things that I thought was most fascinating about this paper. This studied the title annotations about visuals. If you have a small bias in a title, it can significantly influence viewer perception, because if the title isn't super biased, we intuitively interpret the chart as unbiased data. So you're more vulnerable to manipulation through the context of the title. Annotations, as shown in the gun violence diagram on the second slide, can draw attention to specific patterns in the visualization and lead to more consistent conclusions from viewers. Biggest takeaway here, when bias is overt, viewers are skeptical about the visuals. But when the bias is a little bit more subtle, viewers let their guard down, don't engage their critical thinking top-down, bottom-up process, and rely more on contextual elements like titles, annotations, accompanying text for interpretation, and a bias or a misinterpretation can slide in there. Here's another example of a misleading annotation. COVID-19 cases in Uruguay. They have an annotation for when vaccines were introduced, and after that, we see a significant rise in cases. So, do vaccines cause COVID-19? I don't know. That seems to be the conclusion that they're trying to get me to come to viewing this diagram. Moving on to research question 2, exploring combating misleading diagrams with education. Another big dump of all the papers that they studied and the results from those. Again, I'll have some compound information for that. Basically, all these papers focused on active training, where they present a viewer with graphs and give them different types of annotations and study what kind of annotations or feedback trains viewers to engage their critical thinking processes more often. I've got an example for that. So these bar charts, these are examples of A, annotation and or additional context, and B, feedback on a misleading diagram that was provided to some viewers in some studies here. Providing a corrected alternative to a misleading visualization proved to be the most effective training or educational method for viewers. But it's important to note that the brain is a muscle and you have to keep working it out. They studied viewers over a period of time and found that the incidence rate for somebody misinterpreting a graph increased after the training, after a significant period of time had elapsed after training, showing that the effect of this training fades over time. We're more likely to become lazy. This is an active thing that we have to keep up. Here's another example of visual aids signaling the presence of misleading elements. A, they included a gradient to show that the bar chart was truncated. B, they drew attention to the presence of dual axis in the diagram. And C, they presented a alternative line chart that wasn't dual axis or truncated to show how some of the data in here has been misinterpreted. Conclusions drawn from the paper. Here's the limitations that they specifically mentioned. I put these in because it covered a lot of my demerits of the paper. They basically focused on the most common types of visuals: bar plots, line plots, pie charts. So what they considered a misleading graphical element was greatly influenced by that. One contextual thing that they didn't examine, that they mentioned that I was going to bring up, was they didn't examine peer influence or how we're exposed to the visualization and how that influences a viewer's perception or likelihood to engage critical thinking. It also, all of these studies basically assume that viewers are literate, don't really have an age language barrier, and it's only really focused on quantitative data visualizations. Didn't really include any qualitative or categorical data. My own personal pros and cons of the paper, they did a really good job explaining background visualization practices, informational gestalt, Tufte's name was dropped in the paper, and a breakdown of the misleading information that could be present in there. My takeaways from the paper, my demerits, some of these studies that they've shown in misleading elements and education were fairly outdated. I think I saw one from the 1980s in there. Most of the training studies or the education studies focused on interventional or preliminary training. They required a viewer to encounter a visualization that another person had already seen, deemed manipulative, and put an annotation or additional information alongside it. It didn't really train people to see a visualization in the wild and engage their critical thinking, which comes to my third point. Combating misleading information only requires being fully attentive at all times. It's that simple. Just be locked in 100% all the time on everything, and you'll never see another misleading graph. All right. And here's all the references they included and some of mine for the paper. Thank you.
Well, thank you. So I think a takeaway for everyone on the project would be pay attention to your axes. I know those automatic visualization tools, if you're using them, might decide something for you, but it may not be the most accurate thing for that particular problem you're looking at. So that's something everyone needs to kind of focus going forward. Pay attention to axes. 3D is not necessarily great. I mean, it looks cool sometimes, but it just can be misleading. Visualization community kind of is split halfway. Some people say it's good. Some people say it's not good. But you saw that at least maybe for simple things, it may not be that great. That 3D visualization, 3D pie chart. And one thing that's not in there, but also consider it for the project, the order in which things are put in a chart, especially if you have a way, is it alphabetic the best? Is it, do you need to sort it? And a lot of these tools would allow you to sort data, put it alphabetically, put it in some other order. So that's something to consider, but that was a good